Okay, welcome back, guys. This is just me again. Today, I wanted to dive into some of the research of Tudor Parfitt. Tudor Parfitt is a British historian who has done most of his work surrounding ancient Jewish origins. He looks into ancient ancestry of descendants of Israel, that particularly in Asia and Africa and the Americas. He's also done some research work surrounding genetics. More in particular, with some of his work includes his involvement with uncovering the Cohen gene found in Limba populations. Um, and if you don't know what the Cohen gene is, it's actually the gene that points to the the priesthood of Aaron. That particular gene is traditionally found scattered amongst Jewish populations across the globe. Interestingly, the Kohanim gene found in the Limba population was of higher frequency than most other Jewish populations. So um, that was an old research. I'm not sure if that's changed or not, but that's definitely, I think, something to be of notable of his research. Here are some of his books. Today we're just gonna kind of brief in on this particular book, which is called "The Black Jews of Africa and the Americas." We're going to dive right into chapter 9. The reason why I want to kind of dive into this book today is I feel that it has some relation to some of the findings we found in some of the DNA tests we looked over the last few days. More specifically, that um, migration patterns of various African tribes that have some type of matches found, whether in the Iberian Peninsula, where Jews had lived in Portugal and Spain, as well as in Morocco, prior to their persecution by Muslims, which pushed them further down into West Africa. Also, too, migration patterns leaving Palestine or Israel and Lebanon area into North Africa, and then further. The oral traditions of these tribes that follow the migration patterns of the DNA. This book, I feel, substantiates some of that from a historical perspective, or I should say, the science substantiates some of this book, the historicity of this book as well. So, diving right into this particular passage, it says, description of black Jews living in West Africa go back to John Ogilvie, the English translator and publisher, whose works ranged from translation of Homer to his famous series of books on geography. He noted, of the coast of Guinea, many Jews are also scattered over this region, some natives, boasting themselves of Abraham's seed, inhabiting both sides of River Niger. Others are Asian, strangers who fled either from desolation of Jerusalem by Vespasian, or Judea wasted and depopulated by the Romans, Persians and Saccarians and Christians. All right. Similarly, there are scattered references to black Jews in Portuguese territories in West Africa. Friedrich Ratzel described them as Mavumba, renowned potters and smiths, to whom some assign Jewish origin. Jews expelled from Portugal being alleged to have settled in Saint Tome, and to have sent a branch this way. In Saint Tome and neighboring Principe Islands, about 150 miles off northwest coast of Gabon, there were indeed well-attested communities of part Jewish descent who were originally expelled from Portugal in considerable numbers following the forced expulsion of the Jews in 1497. In 1601, the Portuguese crown gave orders permitting Jewish merchants based mainly in Cape Verde Islands to settle and trade along the Senegambian and the Upper Guinea coast. So just that portion right there, guys, of this book validates, from a historical perspective, even going farther back to the early 1600s, and the perspective of Europeans, that historians and geographers, that there were obviously Jews that were expelled from Portugal and Spain, living on the coast of Guinea and throughout West Africa. This is not popular information. This is not the information you're going to learn in school. You're not going to learn it at your local church or synagogue. This is the type of information that you're going to have to either go buy books like this, or you're going to have to get a Just Store account. But it's highly academic, highly researched data, right? So without a shadow of a doubt, from a historical perspective, from the works of Tutor Parfitt and Ogilvy, we know that there were Black Jews who originally lived in Portugal and Spain before the expulsion, found themselves in West Africa. Anyways, we'll go a little bit deeper into this part of this book right here. In Senegambia, a number of conversos. The conversos were the forced ones, the Jewish converts to Christianity, who during the Middle Ages, if you don't know, the forced ones were basically the Jews who were forced into Christianity. There was actually an edict that was written by the Pope. If you can look all this information up, and it's actually it was a part of the doctrine of discovery, where the Pope had put this edict together. It's quoted, it's titled as the Papal Bull, but basically the edict was that that basically the heretic, saccharins, just anybody that was not a part of the order or of that particular faith, that not only could they be found out, they could be found, their land, certain things could be taken from them. And then also too, there was even a notice, this particular edict, Papa Bull, was basically, it noted that they should or could go into perpetual slavery. So you got to remember that this is prior to the Portuguese slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade. But it's interesting that that's referenced, right? That they could have things taken from them. You know, like I said, all this is a part of the Inquisition. Most likely die or even go into perpetual servitude, perpetual slavery. And then soon after, guess what happened? You have the expulsion, and then you have the Portuguese slave trade, starting in the same places that most of these Jews were expelled to. Anyways, that's a whole nother segment. We won't go there yet. We'll do another video on that. And trying to get some view on this. Kind of getting some extra. I don't know if you guys can read that or not. Okay. So in Senegambia, a number of conversos took advantage of the distance from the Portugal to return publicly to their ancestral faith. At Portugal, south of Dakar, in 1606, a certain Father Barreira observed a village of 100 Portuguese who followed the law of Moses. From the beginning of the 17th century, these Jews, some of mixed Portuguese African descent, some with African wives and servants, were often engaged in legal import of swords. The descendants of these Jews and other Portuguese of Cape Verde Islanders and West Africans developed a culture that was itself a synthesis of African and European elements. The Scottish explorer Mungo Park described having encountered some Arabic-speaking Jews in West Africa on the left bank of the river Niger, and remarked that there were said to be many Jews nearby in Timbuktu. It can be imagined that the presence of Sephardi Jews and their African descendants along the west coast of Africa, and Jews active in trade routes to the north, left some traces and influenced African religious praxis in some places. Guys, this is pretty interesting, right? I mean, we're going to stop there, but this book is fascinating because it dives into things that you're just not going to hear. You know, you're not going to hear about this stuff. And this is documented research. So I find it fascinating that you have this researcher, these various researchers, that emphatically state that there were Black African Jews in numbers living in West Africa, right? And that they not only had these oral traditions that point to Israel, but they had affinity that pointed them to Portugal and Spain, even to the Sephardi, right? Um, if you go talk about this in a lot of circles, you're just people are not gonna listen, right? But this is the reason why we want to share these books. This is the reason why I think it's important to share these books and this research, because the goal is to get the information out there so people can read it for themselves. Um, if you notice that one part we just read, it actually talked about um, Arabic speaking Jews or Arabic speaking Jews. Well, what's fascinating is if you look at the Yoruba, we talked about the Yoruba yesterday. Yoruba are the African tribe that live near and among the Igbo. They're a subset of African Jews that live among the Yoruba population that have an oral tradition that they saw the Assyrian conquest when in Africa. Another um, oral tradition, I think from what I understood, there's two oral traditions. One is that they saw the Assyrian conquest, found themselves moving further north to North Africa, and then further into the interior due to persecution. Um, the some of the migration pattern associated with the subclade, the E1b7a, that is associated with the Yoruba population, also shows migration patterns coming out of not only originally pointing to ancestral Israel, but also to Portugal and Spain during the time of prior to the expulsion, showing migration patterns there, and then showing further migration patterns further in North Africa, Morocco, as well as admixture pointing to Moroccan Jews and North African Jews, which is commonly associated with Sephardim, right? So the thing that's fascinating is about the Yoruba is not only that their subclade matches the oral tradition that they make mention of, but it also matches the history of some of the Sephardi that had found themselves in West Africa, right after the expulsion. Another thing that's fascinating is those that had come down from Morocco via their oral tradition, they also speak a dialect of Moroccan Arabic, Maghrebi, right? And which I think is fascinating, because in this book we just read that even back at the time of John Ogilvie, or around that time, somewhere between the 1600s, that they actually found these same, I don't know if this was specifically this particular tribe, but there was a particular tribe that lived in West Africa that had a mixture language of Moroccan Arabic. So I think there's a lot of details that are being mapped together here, right? Whether it's through the history or through the science, it seems to all map itself together. So I think there's some validity that a, a portion of West African tribes, subsets of West African tribes, were in fact the descendants of Jews that came from Israel into West Africa, and then Jews that came from Portugal and Spain later on into West Africa. The DNA follows the migration patterns, but then also too, it begs this other idea that these tribes have this subclade, right? But this subclade is also found in African in a portion of African Americans today. So one could make the argument that a great deal not only of the Igbo or the Limba, but also the Yoruba have this affinity to Israel, as well as their descendants who live in America today that carry the same haplogroup that points all the way back to the Natufian remains, and that follows the oral tradition and the migration pattern that matches the oral tradition of the Jews of Portugal and Spain. Have a great one, guys.